We like to believe the samurai lived and died by honor and loyalty, but Japan was shaped by men who broke those rules. In the wars that created feudal Japan, betrayal wasn't an exception. It was a strategy. If you enjoy history without romanticism, subscribe to Fragments of History, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. The image of the perfectly loyal samurai is a beautiful lie. We picture men who would rather die than betray their lords, warriors who held honor above life, who stayed faithful through any hardship. That vision dominates popular history. Films, novels, clean narratives that feel emotionally true, but it isn't how feudal Japan actually worked. Modern belief in absolute samurai loyalty comes largely from Bushido, the way of the warrior, as a formalized code that hardened long after the wars that forged Japan's political order. By the Edo period, when scholars and officials put these ideals into writing, Japan had been at peace for generations. Samurai were no longer living on campaign. They were administrators. Their swords were often symbols, not necessities. The code they celebrated was shaped by distance and hindsight, nostalgia for a past already rewritten. This is where the confusion begins. People mistake the ideal for the practice. Every society has a gap between what it praises and what it survives by. But in wartime Japan, that gap was wide enough to swallow lives. Warriors were taught loyalty and honor, while living inside a political environment where rigid loyalty could be fatal. Everyone knew the official rules. Everyone also understood what happened to the men who followed them too literally. In practice, loyalty was conditional. A samurai's oath to his lord mattered, but so did his obligations to his household, his assessment of his lord's competence, and his sense of which side would still exist when the fighting ended. When these pressures aligned, loyalty looked pure. When they collided, decisions were made through calculation, not poetry. The choice was rarely honor or shame. More often it was survive or vanish. Land, not honor, was the foundation of samurai life. Service was tied to reward, productive territory, income, the means to feed a family and keep retainers. When a lord lost land or could not protect what his men already held, the practical basis for loyalty eroded. Watching your livelihood collapse while your lord made catastrophic decisions left you with a brutal equation. Stay loyal and watch your family starve, or leave and secure their future under someone stronger. Economics decided what philosophy could not, and family sat above everything. A samurai's first responsibility was the survival and advancement of his lineage. Serving a lord was never the highest obligation. It was a relationship meant to serve that deeper duty. Lords demanded absolute loyalty in public, but the system ran on a quieter truth. If allegiance threatened a household's future, allegiance could be reconsidered. The arrangement was understood as instrumental, not sacred. It could be renegotiated when circumstances changed enough. Power, more than morality, shaped loyalty. Strong lords who won battles, rewarded followers, and protected holdings inspired real commitment because commitment paid. Weak lords inspired loyalty only while alternatives were worse: lose too many battles, make too many mistakes, fail to provide protection, and you forced your men to look elsewhere. The moment a more viable patron appeared, loyalty became a problem to solve, not a vow to die for. That reality created instability at the heart of the system. Every lord knew his retainers were watching, weighing, recalculating. He understood that victory wasn't just about defeating enemies. It was about holding his own men in place. That required success, rewards, and constant proof of competence. The bond between lord and warrior was maintained through mutual interest more than moral commitment. Lords needed fighters, warriors needed land and protection. When the exchange failed, so did the loyalty. The conflict that shaped feudal Japan wasn't primarily ideological. It was structural. Multiple power centers competed, and there was no reliable mechanism to resolve disputes peacefully. Warriors lived inside those contradictions, caught between competing obligations that could not all be satisfied at once. The wars that determined Japan's future grew out of this instability, not from a handful of rare moral collapses, not from exceptional villains who broke the code. In that environment, betrayal became less a scandal than a strategy. When survival required switching sides, when preserving your household meant abandoning a losing cause, when opportunity arrived in the camp of an enemy, men who clung to failing loyalties did not become legends. They became erased families, extinct lineages, names that disappeared from the record because they could not adapt when adaptation was the only way to stay alive. The myth of perfect loyalty persists because it is useful. It turns chaos into a moral tale. Heroes and traitors, virtue and corruption, honor rewarded in the end. It comforts and it simplifies. But it also misrepresents how power functioned during the centuries when Japan's order was decided through violence, negotiation, and shifting allegiances. To understand samurai behavior, you have to hold the contradiction in your hands. Publicly, warriors performed loyalty. Privately, they read the battlefield like a ledger, measuring risk, weighing obligation, searching for the line between duty and extinction. This wasn't simple hypocrisy. It was adaptive behavior in a world where pure principle could get you killed, and flexible interpretation could keep your children alive. Even the historical record bends under this pressure. Chronicles were often written by the victorious for the victorious, men with every incentive to present their rise as legitimate, necessary, honorable. Betrayals that benefited the winning side were softened, justified, reframed, or quietly omitted. Betrayals that failed were condemned as proof of dishonor. The same act could be called treason or wisdom, depending on who survived to name it. The wars that created feudal Japan were not fought by men who refused to break their vows. They were fought by men who understood loyalty as a tool, and who lived inside a system that made betrayal not only possible, but inevitable. And once you see that, you start to notice something colder beneath the legend. The most dangerous betrayals weren't the dramatic ones. They were the quiet decisions made long before the battlefield, when a clan realized its lord was already doomed and began preparing to live through his fall. The Genpei War lasted 5 years, but the instability that produced it had been building for decades. By 1180, when the Taira and Minamoto moved toward open confrontation, Japan was already deep into a slow political fracture. The imperial court had lost practical control. Regional power holders were no longer simply serving the center. They were consolidating their own autonomous bases. Legitimacy splintered into competing claims that could not all be true at once. This was not a temporary crisis waiting for a treaty. It was systemic breakdown, and it would not end until one faction forced the others into silence. A prolonged civil war doesn't just extend violence, it changes the mathematics of loyalty. When conflict lasts weeks or months, warriors can endure hardship with the expectation that stability will return. When it drags on for years, that expectation dies. Reserves disappear. Households burn through stored grain and savings. Fields go untended. Trade thins. The idea that suffering is temporary becomes a dangerous illusion. Warriors, watching their resources collapse while the fighting produces no conclusion, are pushed toward choices they would never make in a shorter war, because the future is no longer guaranteed. And pressure came from every direction at once. Clans faced rival armies at their borders, economic strain from disrupted agriculture, and internal tension as resources grew scarce. They also faced political uncertainty. Which alliance would still matter next season? Which oath would become a trap? Which partner would survive long enough to reward loyalty? Every decision carried risk. Commit forces to one campaign, and another territory becomes exposed. Support one ally, and you may be making an enemy of a future winner. Defend what you have, and you lose opportunities to gain what you need. Under that kind of relentless, multi-directional pressure, perfect loyalty wasn't a virtue. It was a liability. Scarcity made the problem worse. Loyalty can be preached when there is surplus. In famine conditions, economic or literal, it becomes a luxury. Supporting a retinue required grain to feed it and stability to equip it. Extended warfare undermined both. Farmers fled or were conscripted. Rice paddies went unplanted. Routes that once carried goods became dangerous and unreliable. The foundation that kept warriors loyal, land, income, protection, eroded. A lord who could not feed his men could not keep them. In the end, hunger persuades faster than philosophy. So political survival demanded adaptation. Alliances that made sense one year became poison the next, as fortunes shifted and opportunities opened elsewhere. Clans that bound themselves irrevocably to a single partner could find themselves trapped in a failing cause, with no path out except destruction. The clans that endured cultivated flexibility. They maintained more than one relationship. They kept doors open. They positioned themselves so that, if the ground shifted, they could shift with it. This wasn't rare treachery. It was how politics functioned when the system itself was unstable. Alliance shifting became so common that it was normalized, even while everyone publicly condemned it. Minor clans negotiated with multiple powers, extracting concessions from each by hinting they could support the other. Even major players maintained back channels, not because they lacked conviction, but because conviction without contingency planning was suicidal. Formal ceremonies of eternal loyalty still took place, spoken with straight faces. Yet everyone understood what eternal often meant in practice, until circumstances change enough to make it impossible. In that world, betrayal wasn't an emotional collapse, it was risk management. Warriors weighed the likelihood of their lord's victory, assessed the cost of backing a losing side, and calculated the timing of a switch to maximize advantage while minimizing retaliation. The best of them made these judgments with cold precision. They weren't always cowards. They weren't necessarily unprincipled. They were navigating an environment that punished rigidity and rewarded the ability to read danger early. But reputation still mattered, just not as much as survival. A name for loyalty made a warrior more attractive to lords and less likely to be watched for disloyalty. Yet loyalty without survival produced nothing. A warrior who died with a doomed lord left no descendants to inherit his reputation. A warrior who switched at the optimal moment, secured land or protection, and survived could rebuild his standing through renewed service to his new patron. Reputation could be repaired. Extinction could not. The feudal system itself rewarded the winner regardless of method. A lord who succeeded by force, by intimidation, by absorbing defectors from enemy camps, received legitimacy, tribute, and territory. A lord who lost while maintaining perfect honor received dispossession and ruin. The system did not reward moral purity. It rewarded the acquisition and maintenance of power. That reality created incentives so strong that morality became something discussed after victory, not before it. And because winners controlled the narrative, victory determined virtue. Betrayals that strengthened a successful cause could be reframed as justified responses to impossible circumstances, proof that the betrayed lord had somehow forfeited loyalty. The same act, performed for a losing side, became dishonorable treachery. Moral judgment followed outcomes. It did not prevent them. In such a world, honor could not shield you from consequences. Only survival could. The pressure to betray did not come only from enemies. It came from inside the household. Family obligations were older than any lord-retainer bond, and they did not die on the battlefield. A clan elder, watching his lineage approach destruction under an incompetent patron, faced a grim question. Which duty was higher, obedience to a lord or continuity of the family across generations? In many cases, there was no clean choice. Any path forward meant betraying someone or something. The tragedy wasn't that men lacked honor. The tragedy was that the system offered no honorable exit. Economics sharpened the blade. Switching sides at the right moment could mean the difference between dispossession and land grants, between poverty and security, between a family's decline and its advancement. These decisions weren't abstractions. They were about whether children would eat, whether households would endure, whether decades of status would vanish in a single season. Calling betrayal a simple moral failure misses the reality. Conditions often made it the rational choice. And the longer the wars continued, the more betrayal fed itself. Each successful defection proved it was possible. Each reward given to a turncoat taught others that switching sides could be profitable. As betrayals became more frequent, lords adjusted. They grew less shocked by treachery and more willing to accept it, especially when a defector brought something useful. The practice became easier, more familiar, more expected, even as official condemnation remained loudly intact. Information amplified everything. Intelligence about defenses, troop movements, weaknesses, and plans became as valuable as sword skill. A warrior who crossed over with detailed knowledge of his former lord's positions could command major rewards. That created a darker incentive to prepare for potential betrayal by collecting intelligence in advance, just in case leaving became necessary or advantageous. Betrayal and espionage began to intertwine, each strengthening the other, each turning loyalty into something that could be traded. So the question was never whether betrayal would happen. The question was when and who would move first. Because once a gate is opened at night, once information leaks, once an army discovers the enemy already knows its weakness, the battlefield stops being a contest of courage. It becomes a contest of collapse. Battles were often decided before the first arrow flew, plans shared in tight circles, movements meant to surprise, feints designed to mislead, weaknesses meant to stay hidden, somehow arrived in enemy hands hours before execution. Troops marched into ambushes, prepared with unnerving confidence. Defensive gaps were struck with a precision that felt less like brilliance and more like familiarity. These outcomes weren't the result of luck or even exceptional scouting. They were purchased. A warrior who believed his lord was failing could make himself valuable to the enemy by selling what only an insider could know, and the information that leaked was rarely vague. It wasn't just they're attacking from the east, it was numbers, timetables, guard rotations, the location of supplies, the names of officers holding key positions. Sometimes it included contingencies, what the commander would do if the first plan failed, so the enemy could neutralize flexibility itself. By the time swords met, the battle had already been hollowed out by a betrayal that happened days earlier, in silence. During sieges, the pattern became even more brutal. Gates opened at night with a regularity that should have been impossible. Fortifications that could have held for months fell in days because a crucial entrance was left unsecured, or a guard post was suddenly empty at the exact moment it mattered. These weren't innocent oversights. They were agreements carried out under cover of darkness. Defenders who had negotiated terms, decided their price, and turned a wall into a doorway. Once an entry point was compromised, betrayal didn't stop there. It moved inward like fire. While defenders faced outward, men who had already shifted allegiance struck from inside. Commanders were targeted, key areas were set ablaze, prisoners were released to multiply confusion, and multiple points were opened at once, so a single repair wouldn't stop the flood. A siege, meant to be slow, exhausting attrition, could become a sudden collapse, not because the walls failed, but because the loyalty behind them did. Betrayal wasn't always as obvious as an opened gate. Sometimes it wore the mask of strategy. A necessary retreat at the worst possible moment could destroy an allied force more efficiently than any enemy charge. A clan would pledge to hold a position or support an advance, then withdraw when their presence mattered most, leaving allies surrounded. Officially, it was explained as unexpected pressure, a shifting threat, a tactical recalculation. But the timing was often too clean and the consequences too predictable. The retreating forces survived. Their allies did not. The strategic balance shifted exactly as it would if someone had intended it. Entire armies could be abandoned mid-campaign. A commander deep in hostile territory would realize reinforcements weren't coming. Supplies had been cut by raiders. Allied forces had been redirected elsewhere without warning. The result was the same: stranded soldiers with no way to advance and no safe path home. Disasters like these didn't just happen. They benefited someone, and the excuses were always convenient enough that the truth could never be proven, only suspected. Then there were the betrayals that happened in full view, in the middle of combat. Warriors fought for hours and then, at the decisive moment, raised a new banner and turned their blades on men they had been standing beside. The tactical impact mattered, but the psychological shock mattered more. Once soldiers saw it happen, trust died instantly. Every ally became a question. Every movement became suspicious. Victory didn't require annihilating an army if you could poison it from the inside. At Dan no Ura, Taguchi Shigeyoshi's mid-battle betrayal and his revelation of the emperor's location did exactly that. What had been chaotic uncertainty became Minamoto advantage. The battle didn't suddenly become more honorable. It became more final. A single shift, a single piece of information, and the balance of life and death moved with it. Under that pressure, honor stopped functioning as a guide. When defeat was immediate and capture meant ruin, warriors made decisions in seconds. Oaths and principles didn't vanish. They simply became less persuasive than survival. A samurai watching his lord falter had to choose quickly: die for a cause that was collapsing, or live by making whatever bargain was available with whoever was rising. The battlefield stripped away the performance. It revealed what had always been underneath. The romantic image of honorable combat, formal challenges, single duels, mutual respect, could not survive contact with this reality. Real warfare involved advantage taken whenever it appeared, striking from behind, overwhelming isolated men, finishing the wounded, exploiting panic. Warriors who insisted on behaving properly while opponents did not were not admired for long. They were removed from the field. The survivors were those who abandoned ceremony first, because ceremony did not stop steel. Victories gained through betrayal were victories all the same. Commanders who accepted defectors, paid them, and used their intelligence won campaigns that shaped Japan's future. The lack of glory did not make those victories less decisive. History remembers the outcome, not the method. A leader who refused to use betrayal on principle, but lost because of it, left behind no triumphant narrative, only a grave and an empty household. As betrayals multiplied, trust inside armies began to rot. Commanders hesitated to share full plans because they didn't know who might sell them. Warriors watched each other during combat, waiting for the moment someone might turn. Defensive posts required oversight from within, guards assigned to watch other guards because the sentry could be the one opening the gate. Coordination became harder, suspicion became constant, and yet the system could not reverse itself. Once betrayal became common, the social fabric that made disciplined warfare possible was consumed by the very tactics that helped men survive. Some defections were arranged before battles even began. Warriors quietly negotiated with both sides, agreeing to fight for one, and change banners at a predetermined signal or after specific conditions were met. These weren't impulsive betrayals. They were operations, careful timing, careful appearances, careful risk. A man had to stay loyal long enough to remain valuable, then switch before being exposed. The receiving side had to be ready to protect him the moment he revealed himself, because the window between asset and dead man was thin. The most effective betrayals were the ones that didn't look like betrayal at all. A rout blamed on collapsing morale could hide deliberate sabotage. A failed gate blamed on maintenance could avoid the suspicion that a cleanly opened entrance would invite. The best betrayers engineered failure that looked like incompetence, misfortune, or inevitability, because open treachery was dangerous, but plausible error could pass through history unquestioned, and payment for these acts varied. Some men received immediate land and promotion, some were promised rewards after final victory, some gained nothing beyond permission to live, reduced to serving new masters with less status than before. The negotiation mattered almost as much as the act itself. A warrior who secured strong terms could emerge from betrayal elevated. A warrior who miscalculated could survive his treason, only to be discarded once he was no longer useful. But these battlefield betrayals were not isolated episodes of personal weakness. They were symptoms of something larger. Entire clans watching the tide turn, deciding who would rule, and preparing their move in advance. Because once the first banner changes mid-battle, the next one is easier. And somewhere, before the next clash even begins, someone is already deciding which gate will open. Minor clans held disproportionate power during the Genpei War precisely because they were willing to change sides at the moments that mattered. They weren't the great houses with thousands of warriors and vast territories. They were regional powers, hundreds of fighters, modest landholdings, limited resources. Yet their choices often determined campaigns. A few hundred men positioned in the right valley, controlling the right crossing, threatening the right supply line could tilt an entire front. Both the Taira and the Minamoto understood it, and both competed constantly for the allegiance of clans whose numbers were small, but whose geography made them decisive. These pivot clans survived by cultivating ambiguity. Publicly, they declared support for one faction. Privately, they kept channels open to the other. They joined campaigns, but held back enough strength to remain dangerous if they needed to switch. They positioned themselves so they could threaten supply routes or defensive positions, regardless of who they claimed to serve. Ambiguity became leverage. It allowed them to bargain with both sides and to demand concessions that more openly committed clans could never safely ask for. Oaths, even those sworn with elaborate ceremony, did not hold when the ground shifted. A clan leader might pledge eternal loyalty to the Taira in public ritual, with witnesses and religious weight. Months later, the same man would perform a near-identical ceremony for the Minamoto, as if the first oath had never been spoken. The hypocrisy was obvious, almost shameless, yet repetition made it normal. Everyone understood what the ceremonies really meant. Oaths bound only as long as they remained mutually useful. When staying loyal became suicidal, the system quietly treated circumstance as release. New alliances often formed with suspicious speed. A clan that had fought for the Taira for months would suddenly announce a switch and within days operate inside Minamoto ranks with a smoothness that suggested preparation. Transitions happened too quickly to be improvised. It pointed to negotiations begun long before the public declaration. Arrangements made while the clan still fought beside its former allies, gathering intelligence, positioning itself, easing the future crossing. The betrayal, in other words, was rarely a moment. It was a process. The logic behind it was simple and merciless. Back the winner or lose everything. Every leader knew what defeat meant. Dispossession at best, annihilation at worst. Victory meant reward, sometimes regardless of how late a clan arrived at the winning side. That created an irresistible incentive to switch as soon as one could reasonably predict the outcome. But timing was everything. Switch too early, and you might bet wrong. Switch too late, and the best rewards and the safest positions were already taken by those who moved first. Fear of annihilation drove these decisions harder than any promise of gain. The Genpei War was total in its consequences. Winners did not simply defeat enemies. They dismantled them, confiscating land, erasing power, eliminating the capacity for future resistance. Entire lines could be destroyed. Under that threat, even clans with deep personal ties to a faction faced the same question: sentiment or survival. Leaders who chose honor over preservation weren't condemning only themselves. They were risking the extinction of their household. As the war entered its final years and the Taira position visibly deteriorated, opportunism reached its peak. Clans that had supported the Taira for decades began calculating when to abandon a cause that was clearly sinking. What began as a trickle of defections became a flood. Each departure weakened the Taira further, making the next defection easier to justify and more urgent to execute. The pattern fed itself. Switching accelerated collapse, and collapse accelerated switching. Collective betrayal made that shift easier to live with and safer to survive. A lone warrior who defected carried suspicion and the full weight of dishonor. An entire clan that moved together could present the decision as strategy rather than cowardice. The group provided its own protection, and its value made it harder to discard. Hundreds of armed men arriving at once were not a nuisance. They were an asset the receiving faction would be compelled to accept and defend. Individual defectors could be used and thrown away. A clan was harder to silence. Even the mechanics of switching were built for deniability. A clan could not openly approach an enemy leader without risking immediate retaliation from its current allies. So intermediaries were used. Merchants, monks, distant relatives, figures who could plausibly claim independence if caught. Through them, terms were negotiated in advance. What lands would be retained, what new holdings might be granted, what positions would be offered, what guarantees of protection would be given. Only once the price and the protections were settled did the public loyalty shift, often framed as sudden, necessary, inevitable. Smaller clans had advantages in this marketplace of allegiance. Their defection caused less scandal and fewer internal tensions for the receiving side. Their modest strength made them less threatening if the switch was a trap. Yet their local knowledge and strategic position made them valuable regardless of size. These factors allowed them to secure terms out of proportion to their numbers, turning calculated betrayal into a tool for advancement. As the Tyra network disintegrated through cascading defections, the collapse accelerated. Allies who had supported them for generations recognized that the Tyra could no longer protect them or provide the resources that had once justified loyalty. One by one, clans recalculated and moved. Each defection stripped away more than fighters. It removed local knowledge, defensive depth, supply routes, and regional leverage. The Tyra became increasingly isolated, holding fewer territories with fewer allies, while their enemies were strengthened by the very forces that had once upheld Tyra power. Then came the most important part: what happened after victory. Silence. Once the Minamoto won decisively, there was no benefit in speaking openly about how many supporters had previously fought for the Tyra. Dwelling on widespread betrayal would weaken the legitimacy of the new order and sow tension among allies who now needed to cooperate. The victors had every incentive to minimize what had happened, to emphasize loyalty and honor, to make the victory appear clean, deserved, inevitable. The Minamoto also understood that punishing every former Tyra supporter was impossible and self-defeating. They needed stability, not endless purges, so they created a useful distinction: die-hard Tyra loyalists who deserved punishment, and pragmatic clans who had recognized the Minamoto cause at the appropriate time. That selective memory allowed rewards to be distributed, while moral authority was claimed, even when many rewarded clans had fought against the Minamoto for years. And because records are tools, not mirrors, the details were blurred. Chronicles minimized the extent of switching. Clan histories quietly omitted the years spent on the losing side. The story was reshaped until betrayal looked rare, loyalty looked dominant, and victory looked like virtue rather than recruitment. Later generations would remember a handful of famous individual betrayals, names, moments, dramatic reversals. But the war was decided less by isolated men than by entire clans, moving in silence one after another, until the losing side realized it wasn't being defeated only by enemies, it was being emptied from within. Taguchi Shigeyoshi's name endured for one reason: his betrayal was visible, irreversible, and decisive. At Dan-no-Ura in 1185, Taguchi, only a minor commander within the Taira forces, made a choice that echoed far beyond his own ships. With the battle still uncertain and casualties mounting on both sides, he ordered his vessels to pull away from the Taira line. Then he raised Minamoto banners and turned his attack onto the men he had been fighting beside. The spectacle alone was violent enough. But what made it historically fatal was what he sold with it: the exact location of the imperial flagship carrying 7-year-old Emperor Antoku. The timing was not hesitation, it was calculation. Taguchi did not wait for the aftermath. He did not slip away in the confusion of defeat. He switched while both fleets were fully committed, when retreat was impossible, when everyone could see it, and when the tactical consequences would be immediate. In doing so, he made himself maximally valuable to the Minamoto and maximally protected by them. The Taira could not punish him without first breaking through the enemy line. And just as dangerous as the ships he brought over was what his decision proved to others watching, that a banner could change mid-combat, and that survival might belong to whoever moved first. For the Taira, the deeper wound wasn't the attack, it was the revelation. They had guarded the Emperor's location carefully, shifting him between vessels to keep him from becoming a direct target. Their strategy leaned on a core assumption. Possession of the Emperor made their position untouchable. The Minamoto could not claim legitimate authority without controlling the imperial person, and the idea of targeting the Emperor was supposed to be unthinkable. Taguchi shattered that protection by turning the Emperor from a hidden symbol into a precise coordinate, an identified ship in a crowded, blood-churned sea. In that moment, the political rules that were meant to frame warfare broke in full view. The imperial institution was supposed to sit above factional struggle, contested, controlled, used as legitimacy, but never directly threatened. Taguchi's betrayal didn't merely reveal the Emperor's position. It forced the Minamoto to confront what had been kept theoretical, whether they would pursue victory, even if it meant treating the Emperor as a military objective. That possibility alone was devastating to the Taira. Their defense depended on constraint. When the constraint evaporated, so did their strategic center. The collapse inside the Taira ranks was psychological before it became physical. They had entered battle believing the Emperor guaranteed they could not lose decisively. When that belief failed, everything else began to fail with it. If commanders could switch sides mid-fight, if the Emperor could be targeted, if the assumptions holding the line together were false, then what was sacrifice for? Doubt spread faster than arrows. Men who had been fighting desperately began to look at the sea and understand that the outcome was no longer being decided by strength, but by a sudden absence of meaning. The war's end was decided in those moments, even as the fighting continued. Hours of combat still followed, but the decisive advantage had already been delivered. Once the Minamoto knew where the Emperor was, and showed they were willing to act on that knowledge, the Taira's remaining strengths became less relevant. Naval skill, familiarity with local waters, surviving manpower, none of it restored the protection they had built their entire position around. The battle continued, but the tide had already turned, and victory won this way carried a different kind of weight. The Minamoto triumphed. Their rivals were broken, the imperial person was secured, yet the shape of the victory was troubling even to those who benefited from it. A commander switching sides in the middle of slaughter, a child emperor becoming the center of tactical decision, principles violated because the alternative was losing. The result was complete, but the path to it was morally uncomfortable, strategically perfect, and stained by what it required. Dan no Ura remains the betrayal everyone remembers because it could not be hidden. But it wasn't the only moment where loyalty became a trap. Other betrayals from the Genpei War followed the same logic, even when they played out on a smaller, more personal scale. At Ichinotani in 1184, Kumagai Naozain defeated a young Taira warrior and discovered he was Taira no Atsumori, a 16-year-old noble who reminded him of his own son. Kumagai wanted to spare him, but mercy would be seen as betrayal of his Minamoto duty. He killed the boy, and the act reportedly hollowed him out. He later became a monk, seeking relief from something battlefield necessity demanded, but conscience could not accept. Not every man broke the same way. Some were crushed by what they did. Others seemed to carry betrayal with disturbing ease, switching as circumstances shifted, adapting without visible cost. Taguchi himself vanishes from the record after his famous defection, a silence that suggests only possibilities. Quiet elimination despite his value, or a life lived under the shadow that always follows a proven betrayer. Either way, The disappearance is its own kind of sentence. In this world, even success did not guarantee safety, only continuation. Betrayals that happened away from major battles were just as decisive and far harder to trace. Regional commanders opened gates. Warriors fed allies false intelligence that led them into ambushes. Lords turned on superiors when it served advantage. These actions shaped campaigns but left minimal evidence because the cleanest betrayal was the one that left no proof. That means the historical record inevitably undercounts what was common. The events we can name are the ones too visible to erase. The silences in chronicles are as revealing as the stories they preserve. Accounts written by or for the Minamoto had no interest in emphasizing how dependent victory was on enemy defections rather than virtue and strength. Major betrayals like Taguchi's could not be denied. Too many had seen them. But countless smaller fractures, the quiet deals, the open doors, the conveniently late reinforcements, could be smoothed into narrative or omitted entirely. What survived was a story of deserved triumph. What disappeared was the machinery that made it possible. And beneath the politics were private betrayals that left no room for slogans. Men who had fought side by side, saved each other, sworn brotherhood, found themselves on opposite sides when clans made different calculations. Some severed bonds without hesitation. Some maintained secret friendships across factional lines, risking suspicion and death. The tragedy wasn't only that loyalty failed, it was that larger forces demanded it fail and turned friendship into a liability as surely as any oath. Often the burden of betrayal did not fall evenly. A leader could decide to switch sides and frame it as necessity, then order subordinates to carry out the most intimate acts, opening gates, striking former allies, revealing information. The decision stayed abstract in the commander's mouth. The act became concrete in the hands of men who had no power over the choice. Leaders preserved distance. Subordinates carried the stain, and not every betrayal moved through the battlefield. Women, through household ties, court proximity, and the invisible roots of family connection, could gather information and facilitate communication in ways male warriors often could not. A noblewoman could remain connected to her natal family while married into another clan, becoming a quiet channel between factions. These roles were rarely recorded plainly, but they fed the same currents of intelligence and negotiation that made strategic betrayal possible. Their absence from the record doesn't mean absence from the system, because the system needed betrayers, and yet it never trusted them. The way proven betrayers were treated, rewarded and watched, useful and despised, exposed the contradiction at the heart of feudal loyalty. And once you understand that contradiction, you can see what comes next. The betrayal doesn't end with victory. It continues afterward, when the winners decide which turncoats to embrace and which ones to erase. Immediate rewards were necessary, not as gratitude, but as policy. Betrayal had to look profitable, fast. When Taguchi revealed the Emperor's location and turned on the Taira, the Minamoto could not respond with visible hesitation. Suspicion could come later. In that moment, they needed a message to travel. Clean, loud, undeniable, defect, and you will be paid. Taguchi received land grants, elevated status, and integration into Minamoto structures because the rewards had to be seen. They had to be substantial enough that warriors still serving the Taira would hear the story and begin their own calculations. Stinginess toward early defectors would have killed the cascade the Minamoto depended on. But even as rewards were distributed, everyone understood the price attached. A man who had betrayed once had demonstrated a capability no lord could ignore. He had proved he could break a bond when it benefited him. That made him useful and permanently dangerous. Taguchi could be granted lands and titles, yet he would never be trusted like men whose loyalty record appeared unbroken. Every assignment carried the same unspoken question: is he loyal now or simply waiting? Every suggestion came under suspicion. Is this advice or a setup? In crisis, would he stand or calculate again. So, surveillance became the default treatment for integrated betrayers. They were given guards that looked like protection and functioned like watchers. Their movements were tracked, their communications scrutinized, their relationships monitored for signs of continuing connections. The surveillance wasn't subtle, and it didn't need to be. The betrayer knew he was being observed. The observers knew he knew. Everyone maintained the polite fiction that it was merely security. In reality, it was containment, an invisible leash kept taut at all times. Promotions followed the same logic: reward, then limit. A defector might receive generous initial gifts to encourage others, but future advancement was slow and hedged with restrictions. He could be given command, but not of the largest forces. He could receive land, but not near the most strategically sensitive positions. He might earn titles, but not the intimate advisory roles that required full trust. The system used betrayers while keeping them from becoming too powerful. Their career ceilings were built into their welcome, and their value extended beyond what they could do. A proven betrayer was a walking advertisement. His presence at ceremonies, his public inclusion, his visible prosperity all said the same thing: the winning side is generous. Look how we embrace even those who once fought against us. But that political function was also a kind of exploitation. The betrayer became symbol first, person second, useful for what his existence communicated, not for who he was. That symbolic value could protect him, but it also ensured he would never be allowed to forget what he represented. The long-term punishment was often quieter. Social isolation settled in like cold. A man who switched sides found himself trapped between worlds, too associated with his former faction to be fully accepted by the new one, unable to return to relationships severed by betrayal. He could attend gatherings and be treated with courtesy while feeling the room tighten. Conversations softened when he approached. Smiles held no warmth. No one openly attacked him. They simply never let him in. Politeness became a wall. Isolation was the reminder that reward was not acceptance. The fundamental truth was simple: a betrayer was never allowed to become anything else. He could serve faithfully for decades. He could prove himself in battle. He could die defending his new lord. Yet his identity would still begin with the same label: the one who betrayed. It eclipsed later loyalty, because later loyalty couldn't erase the fact that he had once broken a bond when it suited him. From the perspective of those around him, this wasn't cruelty. It was rational fear applied to demonstrated behavior. Some men tried to fight that fear by becoming hyper-loyal. They volunteered for dangerous missions. They spoke devotion too loudly. They avoided any action that might be misread. It rarely changed how others saw them, but it changed how they survived themselves. It became a way to manage the tension between who they believed they were and how they were seen. The effort to prove trustworthiness was proof they understood they weren't trusted. Others did the opposite. They accepted their reputation and used it. If they would never be trusted, there was no advantage in pretending to be. These men became professional operators, valued precisely because they would do what honorable warriors would not: negotiate with enemies, gather intelligence, handle tasks that required flexible conscience. Paradoxically, embracing the stigma could create a different kind of freedom. They weren't constrained by reputations they couldn't keep anyway. But the price of betrayal didn't stop with the man who committed it. A family carried the history. Descendants inherited the stain in ways that affected marriage prospects, career paths, and social acceptance long after the original act. Some families attempted rehabilitation through exemplary service, but the shadow faded slowly, if it faded at all. Betrayal, then, wasn't only an individual decision, it was a choice that could reshape an entire line. Survival purchased with a reputation debt passed to children and grandchildren. Economic reward could blunt that pain, but it couldn't remove it. A betrayer might be despised yet secure, wealthy enough to protect his household, even if he could never buy genuine belonging. The calculation was stark: poverty with honor, or comfort with suspicion. Many chose comfort not because they didn't understand honor, but because land and food protected families in a way reputation never could. In that choice, the mythology of loyalty met the material reality that governed survival. The relationship between betrayer and new lord remained unequal by nature. The lord valued what the betrayer had provided, but never forgot what it had cost someone else. That memory created a permanent imbalance. The betrayer's options were limited, his reputation narrowed every path. A lord could demand more, harder assignments, riskier duties, because refusal carried consequences the betrayer could not easily escape. The initial generosity was visible, the long-term control was quiet, and sometimes the end was simpler still. Some betrayers were eliminated once they had served their purpose. If a man's value was primarily the intelligence he brought, he could become disposable once that intelligence had been used. A convenient accident, a suicidal assignment, a death that removed a potential security risk, someone who now knew too much about the methods of his new masters. Whether this happened often or rarely, the possibility hung over every defector. Usefulness could expire, and when it did, the safest betrayer was a dead one. A few men rehabilitated themselves fully, but only through extraordinary service that eclipsed the original act. They needed decades of consistent loyalty, and often a moment so unambiguous it forced belief, saving a lord's life, refusing an opportunity to betray again when it would have benefited them. These stories existed, but they were exceptions. Their rarity proved the rule. Suspicion was permanent. As betrayal became common, then routine, the system itself changed. Loyalty could no longer be assumed. It had to be managed. And once loyalty is managed through surveillance, limits, and fear, the old language of honor becomes something else entirely. Not a guide for behavior, but a story told afterward to make the new order feel legitimate. Betrayal stopped being an exceptional sin and became a normal function of feudal politics. By the time the Minamoto consolidated power after 1185, every major lord understood a brutal lesson. Managing betrayal mattered as much as raising armies or governing land. The question was no longer whether subordinates might turn. It was when, under what conditions, and how quickly the damage could be contained. Betrayal was no longer treated as an aberration. It was treated as a constant, something to be anticipated, monitored, and punished before it became fatal. Information was weaponized with new discipline. Lords built networks of informants inside their own domains to watch their own retainers. These weren't operations aimed at enemies. They were surveillance aimed at supposed allies. Every castle, every court, every encampment had men whose true function was observation and reporting. Over time, warriors simply assumed they were being watched and acted accordingly. Loyalty became something performed, carefully visible, meticulously staged, impossible to read as purely sincere. A culture formed where the appearance of devotion mattered as much as devotion itself, because appearance was what kept you alive. Espionage hardened into institution. What had been improvised in wartime became structured practice under the new order. The Minamoto and the Kamakura shogunate developed formal apparatus, dedicated personnel, procedures, channels, training. Intelligence gathering wasn't a desperate necessity anymore. It became administration, monitoring rivals, detecting conspiracies, tracking potential threats. These became routine functions of governance. Espionage was normalized, and once something is normalized, it stops feeling dishonorable. It becomes simply how power protects itself. Internal controls multiplied because lords realized external enemies were not the greatest risk. The most dangerous strike often came from inside the gate. Domains began to reflect that assumption physically and organizationally. Castle layouts and daily routines were shaped to facilitate oversight. Retainers were arranged and rotated in ways that limited opportunities for sabotage. Communication channels became redundant, so one compromised route couldn't collapse the whole system. Even the basic infrastructure of rule was redesigned around a single premise: Betrayal is always possible, and when suspicion fell, waiting for proof became a luxury. Preventive elimination became standard practice. Lords couldn't afford certainty. Certainty arrived too late. The calculation was cold. The cost of sparing a potential betrayer was catastrophic, while the cost of killing a potentially loyal man was acceptable. That logic produced preemptive executions based on association, family history, rumor, circumstantial evidence, anything that could justify acting first. Injustice wasn't denied, it was absorbed as the price of security. As a result, loyalty leaned increasingly on fear, not on honor, not on mutual obligation. Fear proved more reliable. Warriors obeyed because they understood what disobedience or even suspected disloyalty could mean: death, and often punishment extending to family. This was effective. It was also fundamentally different from the honor-driven image later mythology would insist had governed samurai life. The shift was an admission that ideals couldn't prevent betrayal, so stronger forces had to. The political order that emerged from the Genpei War was built out of these lessons. The Kamakura shogunate, established by Minamoto no Yoritomo, was not an experiment in noble reciprocity. It was a control system designed to prevent a return to the chaos that had nearly shattered Japan. Power was centralized. Rivals were systematically contained or eliminated. Loyalty was enforced through surveillance, intimidation, and credible retaliation. It worked not because it inspired devotion, but because it made disobedience and betrayal extremely costly, even for those who might profit from it. Japan's choice of efficiency over honor was not accidental. The survivors of the wars understood that systems based on assumed loyalty did not survive reality. The stable order that followed came from treating self-interest as a constant and building institutions that redirected it toward regime stability. That efficiency prevented the kind of prolonged civil war that had nearly destroyed the country, but it came with an enormous human cost. Quiet, constant, and built into everyday life. To sustain this new logic, bureaucracy expanded. Loyalty histories were recorded. Family relationships were tracked. Communications were monitored. Potential threats were catalogued. Over time, systems emerged that touched nearly every part of feudal existence. Movement between domains, marriages, major decisions. Everything could be observed, noted, evaluated through the lens of loyalty risk. For a pre-modern society, the comprehensiveness was striking. A surveillance state assembled, not from modern technology, but from human networks and institutional fear. Ritual remained, but its purpose changed. Oath-taking ceremonies were less about internal moral commitment and more about creating public documentation, evidence that could be used against a man if he broke. Religious sanctions weren't expected to prevent betrayal through spiritual terror. They made betrayal more politically expensive by adding sacrilege to the accusation. The forms of honor were preserved, but the substance hollowed out. Ceremony became another mechanism of control, a paradox hardened at the center of the system. Everyone condemned betrayal publicly. Everyone assumed betrayal privately. The disconnect was managed through elaborate performances of loyalty that everyone understood were partially theatrical. Warriors pledged eternal devotion while quietly calculating when they might need to shift. Lords accepted the pledges while preparing contingencies for the moment those pledges failed. The system functioned because the official story was treated as necessary fiction, maintained not for truth, but for stability. Economic incentives were engineered to reduce the need for defection. Lords who rewarded followers consistently made loyalty profitable enough to be attractive. Spoils were distributed according to calculated patterns meant to satisfy key supporters and demonstrate that allegiance paid better than alternatives. This wasn't generosity, it was cost-benefit management. Give enough to prevent collapse, but not so much that resources drained away and created new vulnerabilities. Military organization also adapted to the assumption that betrayal could be inside any unit. Armies were structured, so forces watched each other. Critical positions were staffed redundantly, so one defection couldn't destroy an operation. Information was compartmentalized, so no single man could compromise everything. These designs reduced the damage of betrayal, but they also introduced friction, limiting coordination, breeding suspicion, dulling trust. Efficiency was purchased by replacing cohesion with containment, and the psychological cost was heavy, even if rarely spoken. To live inside a system of universal suspicion meant constant awareness that you were observed, evaluated, and one misstep away from lethal interpretation. Anxiety and paranoia became ordinary. The damage wasn't treated as a problem, it was treated as a feature, an unavoidable toll paid for order in a world where trust had failed too many times to be restored. This was the world that emerged when betrayal became normal, and the men who survived in it weren't the ones who held honor at any cost. They were the ones who understood that the cost of surviving had changed and adjusted before the system swallowed them. The warriors, whose family lines endured the chaos, weren't defined by exceptional honor or courage. They were defined by flexibility, by pragmatic intelligence. These were men who understood when principles had become liabilities, who could read shifting power with accuracy, and who made strategic choices about when to maintain loyalty and when to abandon it. They weren't heroes in any clean sense. They were survivors who placed family continuity above abstract ideals. Their descendants would later build mythology celebrating samurai honor, but the ancestors who lived long enough to produce those descendants had survived through calculated adaptation, not rigid obedience to any code. Honor proved to be a luxury survival could not afford. Warriors who maintained perfect loyalty to failing causes died well, and died all the same, taking their line with them. The record preserves their names because their behavior was rare and tragic, the kind of story war tales prefer to remember. The men who survived made different choices. They betrayed when necessary, negotiated when possible, and fought only when it served advantage. Those choices weren't celebrated, they were simply effective, and effectiveness decided which families remained to shape Japan's future. Pragmatism became the real virtue of the age. Knowing when to commit and when to hold back, when to fight and when to bargain, when to stay and when to move. These judgments required a kind of strategic discipline that courage alone could not provide. The most successful warriors treated loyalty as a tool to be used, not a principle to be upheld at any cost. It was morally unsatisfying. It was also superior to the alternatives. Survival itself became a justification powerful enough to swallow shame. A man who made compromising choices could frame them as lineage duty. My ancestors carried this name to me, and I must carry it forward. Under that logic, betrayal became something a warrior could defend as necessity. A man who switched sides to preserve his household could claim he wasn't abandoning his highest obligation, he was fulfilling it. The most adaptable survivors became experts at reading situations before they hardened into traps. They kept channels open to multiple factions. They avoided declarations that would make future realignment impossible. They positioned themselves, geographically and politically, so they had exits when the tide turned. This flexibility demanded constant attention and a willingness to adjust quickly when new information made a former position untenable. The true skill was timing. Move too early and you looked faithless. Move too late and you were caught. They also understood something colder. Context decided morality. Actions condemned as betrayal in one situation could be praised as justified realism in another. The difference wasn't the act, it was the outcome. Whether you attached yourself to the side that won, that understanding freed them from absolutes. They learned to make decisions based on probability, not ideals, and to position themselves for victory before victory became obvious. Honor was pushed into the future, into narrative, rather than used as a guide in the present. Survivors understood that history would be written by winners who could frame their actions as needed. Dishonorable methods that produced victory would be minimized or justified. Honorable sacrifices that ended in defeat would be romanticized or erased. Knowing this, rational men focused on winning. History could be negotiated, death could not. The rewriting was not accidental, it was systematic. Chronicles commissioned under the Kamakura order framed Minamoto victory as inevitable and righteous, attributed to virtue and favor rather than to defections, flexibility, and ruthless calculation. Warriors who switched sides at the right time saw their past softened or omitted. Those who stayed loyal to losing causes were either vilified as stubborn fools or elevated into tragic icons, depending on what the new story needed. The impossible complexity of real decision-making was stripped away until only simple moral shapes remained. But survival carried a cost that land could not erase. Warriors who betrayed often lived with guilt, shame, and the awareness that their public language of honor had been violated by their private actions. Some managed through rationalization or by sealing their conscience behind necessity. Others were haunted, finding success strangely hollow because of how it was achieved. A few turned to religious life, seeking absolution for what practical survival had demanded and conscience could not quiet. Their descendants inherited more than wealth and position. They inherited the uncomfortable origin of those advantages. Families that survived through strategic compromise often worked to obscure it, reconstructing their histories to emphasize loyalty and honor while minimizing the choices that had actually preserved them. Over time, the revision became so thorough that within generations, families could believe their own story, convinced their ancestors had been paragons of loyalty even when the past suggested something far messier. The irony cut deep. The warriors who endured through flexibility became, through their descendants, the foundation for a rigid honor culture that condemned the very behavior that made survival possible. The Bushido, later formalized, was shaped by people whose existence depended on ancestors who had violated almost everything that code would claim to represent. The mythology didn't grow out of wartime truth. It grew out of peacetime need, an aspirational script designed to control men who no longer lived with a blade at their throats. Some survivors recognized that privately. In later writings, a few revealed an awareness of the gap between what happened and what would be claimed. They understood the honor culture being constructed was not history, but a tool, useful for order when the chaos of war was no longer present. They participated in maintaining the fiction because acknowledging it openly would weaken it, and weakening it would invite instability back in. The selection pressure of prolonged warfare had been ruthless. Men who prioritized honor over survival were removed, dead, dispossessed, erased. Those who remained were, almost by definition, those willing to compromise when necessary. That meant the inheritance passing forward, cultural and familial, was shaped by pragmatism, even as the official narrative insisted it was shaped by purity. Japanese warrior culture carried a permanent tension. The values that kept men alive were not the same as the values later praised as sacred. The stability that followed wasn't built on honor either. It was built on mechanisms that assumed honor would fail. Surveillance, punishment, and incentives that made betrayal more dangerous than loyalty. The system worked for centuries because it was grounded in human behavior as it is, not as it was later described. Within that stability, honor could be performed safely because the underlying order prevented it from being tested in the same way again. Modern understanding often misses this split. The warriors celebrated as embodiments of samurai virtue were often those who navigated those virtues most strategically, violating them when necessary, preserving them when useful. Recognizing that doesn't diminish what they accomplished. It changes what their success means. It wasn't purity, it was adaptation. The final truth is simple and brutal. In a world where survival decided who shaped the future, the samurai who survived weren't the ones who best embodied the ideals. They were the ones who understood when the ideals had to be sacrificed for something more fundamental. And once you accept that, the myth of loyalty doesn't just crack, it collapses, revealing what was always underneath. The samurai who shaped Japan were not the most loyal. They were the ones who understood when loyalty became a liability. In a world where survival decided history, betrayal wasn't weakness. It was evolution. Was betrayal a crime or a necessity? Comment below. History is decided by those who survive.